Good evening, everyone. I'm Trey Johnson here at the Kansas Museum of History. Thank you all so much for joining us for this month's Museum After Hours program. I hope you've brought your appetites tonight because we'll be diving into food on the Westward trails. The pioneers who journeyed from the Midwest to California had a challenge that is hard for us to imagine: how to carry enough food for a journey of several months, along with all of their possessions in a vehicle that also had to serve as shelter. Travelers' diets were monotonous, but gave them the calories needed to survive, and they managed to include a few minor luxuries that could bring a hint of home to a desolate prairie camp. Our speaker this evening is Richard Foss, a journalist, author, culinary historian, and lecturer who has contributed to over 40 different publications, including the Encyclopedia of World Food Cultures and the Oxford Companion to Sweets. He taught 500 years of American food and American Fermented for UCLA Extension, is on the board of the Culinary Historians of Southern California, and is the executive director of Collage, a place for art and culture. Foss has 2 published books: Rum, A Global History, and Food in the Air and Space, The Surprising History of Food and Drink in the Skies. Don't forget to put your questions into the chat or use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many questions as we can after the program. So please join me in welcoming Richard Foss.
Thank you very much, Trey, and thank you for playing the piano throughout that movie. I'm sure your fingers are very tired right now.
I do it all the time. What can I say?
Hello out there at the Kansas Historical Society from beautiful Manhattan Beach, California. I'm delighted to be with you today and to talk about food history. And I wanted to mention that sometimes when I tell people that I'm a culinary historian, they give me a puzzled look that lets me know that they've really never heard those 2 words together before. And they have thought sometimes that if they come to one of my lectures or attend one of my classes, that I'm going to be chanting recipes with them and telling them how to cook things. Well, that does happen, but very, very rarely, because of the fact that a culinary history event is as likely to be about the economics of food, the politics of food. We call ourselves culinary historians, but we're also culinary anthropologists, because a lot of what we do is about the way food and culture interact. And they interact in all kinds of different ways. And I'm going to share my screen right at the moment, which I hope will work. Yes, I believe that did. To talk to you about food on the Westward Trail. Now, the trails west were one of those rare epics in human history that was being mythologized while it was still happening. And it was lavishly documented. There were travel guides, there were people like Horace Greeley back in the East who never went west themselves, but were exhorting people, grow with the country. And popular culture brought us an image of this, modern popular culture, that isn't exactly the same as reality. And there's one lovely example of this by an artist by the name of Morton Weisslich, who is a renowned artist of the American West and painted this wonderful supper on the trail. And the first thing I thought when I looked at it was, those people are way too clean. That apron is not going to look anything like that 2 days out from Kansas City, much less 2 weeks. They're also having, that fire is fairly high. As they get a little further out on the plains, they're going to really recognize how much fuel costs you, and they'd probably be more likely to have it a lower fire with the pot a little closer. We noticed one fellow there who has a jug, and we might suspect what's in that jug. They might want to save that for a little bit further along the trail rather than have a libation anytime immediately. Well, whatever's in that pot, well, I say whatever's in that pot, but we know pretty closely what it probably was. They're going to love it. Why? Because of the fact that they have been walking alongside that wagon. They were not all inside, because there isn't that much room in there. Most of them, except the very young children or someone that needed a rest, would have been walking alongside that wagon for the entire day. They would be hungry enough to enjoy anything. There's an old saying that says, hunger is the best sauce for any meal. Boy, it is, because they're going to be working harder than they've ever worked in their lives. Now, that meal, I say we know what it was because of the fact that they had a fairly boring set of provisions that they had day in and day out. And the reason for this is they needed to have some very nutrient dense things that would fit in their wagons. And the cargo space in their wagon is best figured out by this visual metaphor. I think everybody knows what an Econoline van looks like. That at the lower left is an Econoline van. There were a lot of pictures of better ones, but I wanted to pick one that actually made it look like it had made the trip all the way across the plains. Well, as I say in the text here, a cargo van like the Econoline van and a Conestoga wagon have almost exactly the same amount of cargo space. The Econoline van has 260 square feet. The Ford Econoline has 260 square feet as opposed to 278 square feet in the Conestoga wagon. Now, keep in mind, that's stacking that Conestoga wagon all the way to the top. And it has about the same cargo space as an Econoline van. As you can see from that picture of the inside on the lower right, it's crowded in there. And you see some of the items that they have, their clothing, their spinning wheel. They, for some reason, even brought with themselves a nice formal chair. And along with that, they would have had all of the food necessary for a trip of several months. So now imagine yourself trying to pack all of the food, all of the personal items that you would need for a 3 to 4 month trip into a Ford Econoline van and still have room for yourself. Sound challenging? It certainly was. Now, the wagons themselves, you couldn't necessarily pack them all the way full. Why? Because those wagons are going across a roadless expanse, and if you packed the wagon too heavy, it would get stuck in soft sand. It would get stuck in mud. It would be likely to be difficult to control when you were fording unforded rivers, when you were going across by just riding through a river that might be up to the above the hubs of those wheels. So imagine that they couldn't even pack the van, the Econoline, all the way full. They couldn't pack that Conestoga wagon all the way full because then it would be too heavy. If that sounds like it's making it even more difficult, it was. And these vans, the Conestogas, the picture there shows the Conestoga being pulled by horses, which you could do for relatively short distances. But a Conestoga was usually pulled by oxen rather than horses, because the horses do not have the same amount of strength as an ox. Now, I'll note in passing that when I say an ox, for some reason, people tend to think of a castrated male cattle. No, that's called a steer. An ox is not an animal, it's a job description. Because if you use a cow or a steer or a bull to pull something, if it's actually being used as a work animal, pulling a plow or a wagon, now it's an ox. I know a lot of you back in Kansas who are familiar with a lot more Midwestern traditions and history probably know that, but I mention it because a lot of people don't. So you have something that's going at the walking speed of a fully laden cow for 3,000 miles. And this is really difficult. But the people who had the Conestoga wagons, they're the lucky ones. Some of them are making the trips in wagons like this because they couldn't afford a Conestoga, and that has less storage space. These lighter wagons are easier to pull, and a horse can pull them more easily, but they are ill-suited to the job because those lighter wagons both carried less, and when you were going through a river, it is more likely that they will be swept away. So this is what some people had. And there were some people who didn't even have that. They pulled the wagons themselves. The greatest examples of this, and one of the most astonishing survival stories in the history of America, is that of the Mormon handcart pioneers. And the Mormon handcart pioneers were pulling carts just like you see here. They had commissary wagons like the ones you see in the back. Why those look like Conestoga wagons? Probably because they are. And they walked 1,300 miles pulling their own carts. Imagine how much of those people enjoyed being able to stop at the end of the day. Now, this was in 1856 primarily, was the year in which they had a lot of handcart pioneers. They were not crossing the Rockies, so they missed the very worst part of the journey, but still the equivalent of a journey that you just can't imagine. You can't even conceive what this is like. I, as a Californian, tend to think of it as walking from Los Angeles to Vancouver because it's almost the same distance. Their organizational plan, they were lucky in that they had a brilliant organizational plan written by Brigham Young. It allowed 17 pounds of luggage per adult and 10 for children, with, quote, a cow or two for every 10 people. Imagine what you would pick from your home if you were told you could take 17 pounds of luggage for a one-way trip across the country. What's amazing is that most of these people were not familiar with America. They were Europeans who had come directly over, mainly from Holland and Scandinavia. So these were people who knew nothing about the American West, nothing about the wilderness. Their religious faith caused them to believe that they could do this, and the shocking thing was that they did. They had a high survival rate because they were far more disciplined than the American ad hoc wagon trains west that were chosen without distinct leaders and without a real organizing purpose. Sometimes search parties were sent out from Salt Lake City to guide them in and bring them food. But even so, some of these handcart pioneers suffered from starvation when delayed by bad weather, and the last of the handcart trains was in 1860. So basically 1856 to 1860. And after that time, they weren't doing that anymore. So this was a fairly astonishing journey, 1,300 miles. But the pioneers who were going from California, to California and Oregon, were going twice that distance, over worse terrain, over the mountains, in wagon trains that were often dismally badly organized. Unlike the Mormons, who brought cooks with utensils, everybody brought their own. So rather than having the efficiency of everyone having a professional cook who knew what he was doing, and it was generally a he, you instead had people who were all bringing their own stuff, a lot of duplication of effort, but from the things we read, a lot of sharing as things went along and people discovered that other people had not brought the things that they needed. Now we have some contemporary images of dinner at a wagon train. This particular one is noteworthy for two things, one of which was the use of a shovel as a frying pan, which you don't see that often. As I mentioned, the cooking supplies store near me had none in stock. But you know what? Cooking things in shovels is not at all unusual. If any of you have heard of hoe cakes, there are arguments about the origin of hoe cakes. And yes, this is the kind of geeky things that culinary historians argue about, over whether the original hoe cakes were called that because they were made where someone just built a fire on a hoe, used a hoe as a cooking utensil, or whether it was built on something that looked like a hoe or a cooking utensil that had been fashioned in the shape of a hoe. Well, it really makes no difference, because cooking on a shovel is something that is well documented and also that exists not only in this culture. There's one example that is very surprising. Some of you may have had the Japanese dish sukiyaki. The word sukiyaki means cooked on a shovel. So this is something that has happened around the world. At one time or another, someone had that precious metal instrument, and metal throughout most of human history has been very valuable. Someone had a shovel and you just used it for something else. Now, between this and the guy who has the long-handled frying pan, would you rather cook on the shovel or would you rather try to dig a hole using the frying pan? I think they decided to cook on the shovel. Another thing that you see that's prominent in this is that big coffee pot that's sitting right next to the fire. And we know from a lot of records that coffee was one of the things that was absolutely indispensable going across the plains. If people only had a fire to make very, very little of anything, they would make coffee. They would eat their food cold, but they would have the hot coffee. And the odd thing is, they probably had better coffee than a lot of us grew up with. If you grew up with your parents drinking the U-Bahn crystals out of a can, they had better coffee because they roasted it along the trail. So their coffee was fresh roasted the day before, allowed to age overnight, which is how you get it at its very best. Connoisseurs say that coffee is at its best between 4 and 24 hours after it's made, and they would roast their coffee after the family dinner so they could have it the next morning. The reason they did that, well, first of all, after coffee is roasted, it grows stale. Second of all, green coffee takes up about the third of the space of roasted coffee because coffee pops like popcorn. So if you carry the green coffee, you can carry more of it. And as I already mentioned, space is very, very important in those wagons. They had better coffee also because of the fact that green coffee does not get moldy and does not rot when exposed to oxygen as much as coffee that is exposed to moisture or oxygen after it has already been roasted. So they were the equivalent of a rolling Starbucks or whatever group that you particularly like that's making gourmet coffee in your neighborhood. So what were they having besides hoe cakes and coffee? We know what they had because many of them got their shopping lists from guidebooks, some of which were written by people who never actually made the trip. Yes, this happens all the time. One of the earliest and most popular was the 1845 Immigrants' Guide to Oregon and California, which was written by a fellow by the name of Lansford Hastings. And Lansford Hastings had made the trip, although he, in some cases, may have been influenced in his writing by the fact that he knew people who owned property along the route and had set up immigrant camps, and he directed people toward those immigrant camps in order to send them business. And some of those were not the best camps for immigrants, as we will see later. But that 1845 Immigrants' Guide to Oregon and California told the pioneers to take along 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 30 pounds of hardtack, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of sugar, an unspecified amount of beans, and 10 pounds of salt. These are the staples that are listed, to which it was suggested people should bring dried fruit, pickles, rice, tea, and other items if they liked. Well, they'd better bring some of those stuff because of the fact that both their food would be very, very boring, and some of the things like the dried fruit and pickles would give them vitamins that they would not get. The flour, incidentally, anybody who is interested in nutrition knows that whole wheat flour is far better for you in terms of dietary reasons. However, the thing that they would have carried was white flour because of the fact that whole wheat flour, if it gets even slightly damp, is much more likely to go moldy. And whole wheat flour, the oils in whole wheat flour will go rancid, where white flour can be gotten wet, dried out, pounded upon, and then used, where whole wheat flour cannot. So there are some ways in which they would have to make up for the vitamin deficiency of the diet that was most practical. Now, Lansford Hastings, some of the things that he suggested 150 pounds of bacon. One of the things that pioneers along the trail discovered after they'd been out for a month and they'd gone through only about 10 pounds of bacon, and they looked at that 150 pounds and said, we are just not carrying this. We have better purposes for this. And people said that you could actually tell where wagon trains had gone in the early days by following the pile of bacon that people had just thrown by the side of the road so they wouldn't have to carry it. Well, quite naturally, the Native American peoples at this point, to them, these people had invented the food delivery truck, and they were delivering not just food, they were delivering one of the things that everybody loves, bacon. So they would follow the wagon trains, and the people at the wagon trains actually regarded this as a nuisance because the native people would follow them and then would try to beg, borrow, or steal some of their other provisions. So they started actually destroying the bacon, sometimes pouring some kerosene on it or otherwise lighting it on fire because of the fact that they did not want people to be able to follow them. But in the early days, they took far too much bacon. Well, I mentioned that the book was written by Lansford Hastings and that he had some questionable ethics involving his choice of route. And he is remembered for recommending a shortcut that he had never taken. He figured it out on a map and called it the Hastings Cutoff. And it looks great on a map. And one of the reasons that Lansford Hastings recommended it was that he said it does not go through hostile Indian country. That's right, it doesn't, because the Indians were too smart to live there. That route involves a short but grueling trek through the Rocky Mountains of the Wasatch Mountains, Then a march through 80 miles of waterless desert, the Bonneville Salt Flats, and then a detour through the foothills of the Ruby Mountains in Nevada. And the first major group of people to use that route has gone down in history. They were called the Donner Party. The Donner Party followed Lansford Hastings' advice, except in one regard. Lansford Hastings said that you should never start this trip after May. They started it in mid-June. And that meant that they were still in the Rocky Mountains only 2 days from safety. If the snows had come 2 days later, they would have barely made it, but they didn't. And of course, the Donner Party eventually resorted to cannibalism. Most of them died. We're not going to go into cannibalism in culinary history. That would be an entirely different talk, but it's what happened when these people not only followed some questionable advice, they didn't follow the one most valuable element of it, which is to not get stuck, to not leave so late that you could possibly get stuck in this kind of weather. There was someone else who wrote a better guide, but he wrote it 2 years later. His name was Joel Palmer. He wrote it in 1847, and where Hastings recommended 150 pounds of bacon, Palmer recommended 75. And Palmer specified amounts of tea, beans, rice, dried fruit, baking soda, which Hastings did not mention, but was absolutely important for making any baked goods along the way, dried corn, cornmeal, and a keg of vinegar. And even with Palmer's guide, most travelers who arrived in Sacramento still arrived with some bacon left over. So even 75 pounds of bacon was more than necessary. But Joel Palmer was much better. Now we're going to go into some of these things because the definitions of some things changes over the years. For instance, bacon, where the bacon that we buy in a modern store is nothing like the bacon that they had. The bacon that you buy in a modern store will go rancid if it is not refrigerated. The bacon that they bought then, first of all, the word bacon was used as a generic that included many things that we would think of as ham, whether it's Black Forest ham, back leg ham. It was very, very heavily salted, and it was dry cured. That means it's, as you can see, these things can be almost used as a hammer. They are a deadly weapon when used to swing at someone. And this bacon was very dry, very hard. It had a crust on the outside. And as a result, it did not need to be refrigerated. Really traditional hams, like a proper Virginia ham that you would have now, do not require refrigeration because they are so salty, bacteria cannot live on the exterior of them. Now we know about the dryness and salt made it so they could be preserved unrefrigerated because of the fact that some sharp dealers sold inferior products. There was a contemporary humorist by the name of Alonzo Delano, who I highly recommend that you read if you would like to read. He was a proto-Mark Twain, a Western humorist before there was really a tradition of Western humor. He was hilarious, and he wrote about a wonderful trip west with himself and some gleefully incompetent travelers. And he wrote, "We discovered we had been imposed upon in St. Louis in the purchase of our bacon, for it began to exhibit more signs of life than we had bargained for. It became necessary to scrape and smoke it in order to get rid of its tendency to walk in insect form." Alonzo Delano was a light, funny, and very informative. If you are a reader who is interested in the trip west, he is the first place I would go to. He wrote his books under the pen name Old Block, which meant that everybody else was a chip off of him. So they were a chip off the old block. He was the original Old Block, and he's a fun read. And it's a great resource for stories from the trail. So this is the type of ham or bacon that they had. It was something that you had to saw off frequently, to soak in water and change the water once or twice so that it was edible. And after you soaked it in water, you could fry it. And after you fried it, you probably want to be putting it in with some of your beans. Now, what about the beans? It's impossible to say exactly what type of beans were taken along on any given caravan because there were so many types that were then available. It would depend on what somebody was selling in Missouri. And they had kidney, navy, black, pinto. These are all variations on the same species, which is called Phaseolus vulgaris. I'm sorry if somebody speaks Latin fluently, I may have said that wrong. I desecrate other languages, but that's as close as I can come. Well, all of these beans have very similar nutritional profiles in terms that they are rich in proteins, carbs, and minerals. And unfortunately, well, that says it all. So you can live for a very, very long time on beans, and they reheat well and can be eaten cold if necessary. And actually letting beans cook, letting them cool, and then reheating them in some ways they are more digestible. So if you ever heat leftover beans, you actually will probably get more nutrition from them. However, I would like to correct one thing. A lot of people are familiar with the item from Mexican cuisine that is called refried beans. Refried beans are not beans that are fried twice. It's from the Mexican word refritos, which means well cooked. It does not mean refried. It's one of those false cognates into English. So there were several grades of flour that were sold. I mentioned about whole wheat. The types that were available were shorts, middlings, fine, and superfine, which depends on the amount of bran and the fineness of the grind. And whatever kind of flour you got, it was probably better for you to get one of the medium grinds and one of the ones with less bran. The bran will keep you regular, but it has very little other than nutritional fiber to recommend it. One thing about it was the flour sacks. The very, very tightly woven flour sacks were almost completely waterproof. And as a lot of you may know, when the bags became empty, they were repurposed into clothing. And many a woman left Kansas City in tailored clothes and arrived in California wearing less stylish, but much more comfortable and practical flour sacks. So the flour sacks, different flour companies competed with each other in printing on the exterior of their flour bags so that women could use these flour sacks as clothing, because they figured women would buy the prettier flour sacks knowing that eventually they'd be wearing them. Now, the flour, of course, was used to make bread, sometimes pancakes, and it was generally made in a Dutch oven, probably using saleratus, which is sodium or potassium bicarbonate, which would be combined with cream of tartar to create baking powder. And this would be used to make baking powder biscuits. Now, there are older pictures, but I use this one just because look at that guy. Has anybody ever looked that proud of a bunch of biscuits? I mean, you just want to eat those because that guy is obviously certain that they came out great. He's probably been dead for 150 years, and I just want to know what his biscuits tasted like because, wow, he looks happy with them. Now, the saleratus, the ones made with sodium bicarbonate, they are not as good. The baking powder biscuits, most people do not like as much as the yeast-risen biscuits, but yeast-risen biscuits are much more chancy. Some people did go from the east to the west with taking their own yeast bubbling and have it, but you have to feed it. If it gets too hot, then it can actually kill your yeast. The yeast can get infected with something else. It can go moldy. So it's much safer to use some variety of baking powder. So the biscuits, when bad weather or lack of fuel made a prolonged fire impossible, or when people were too tired to make biscuits, they were just in a hurry, they would make the flour into dumplings and they would put it into a soup with bacon and any dehydrated or foraged vegetables. People usually did carry a stock of dehydrated or foraged vegetables, which they rationed very, very carefully. They could see after the first day or two the speed at which those were disappearing if you had them as a separate side dish. So they would put a little bit into their beans or into their soup to make it a little bit more interesting. And the rehydrated vegetables and rehydrated fruits, they did not have the very best reputation. For instance, this is reflected in a contemporary poem. I loathe, abhor, detest, despise, abominate dried apple pies. I like good bread, I like good meat, or anything that's fit to eat. But of all the poor grub beneath the skies, the poorest is dried apple pies. There are about 5 verses of that. They're very repetitive. This person had a long time going across the Western plains, eating dried apple pies as the greatest treat that they had, and not finding it a lot of a treat. Um, in retrospect, it's kind of remarkable that there were no known cases of actual debilitating scurvy among the pioneers. There were numerous rumors of it, but when I have tried to find any documented examples of people arriving in California or Oregon suffering from scurvy, with the exception of the Donner Party, who definitely were suffering from it, but they were suffering from starvation, so they had enough problems. But there were no well-documented examples of people actually having scurvy along the trail. There's a wonderful book that I recommend, that if you're looking for a single book about the American frontier and food on the Trail West, I recommend a book called Bacon, Beans, and Galantines: Food and Foodways on the Western Frontier. It's by a fellow by the name of Joseph Conlin, Conlin. Conlin recorded that some merchants rushed fruit to Sacramento because there were rumors that people were arriving with scurvy. So they rushed fruit to Sacramento, priced it at very high prices, and nobody bought it because they weren't suffering with scurvy. They waited until it started to go bad, bought it, dried it, and laughed at the people who were trying to sell it expensive. So among the staples recommended by both Hastings and Palmer, there were no vegetables. They were regarded as optional. So this commercial label from the 1950s is ironic. I mean, do you see any vegetables? It's Western vegetables. What do you see there that looks edible? The people who actually use Conestoga wagons, as in this Conestoga brand, they would have adored fresh vegetables while going through country like this. Customers hoped to supplement their food with wild plants and with game animals. And there was a lot of wild food along the way, and those who bothered to learn Native American foodways were way ahead of everybody else. Almost all the way across the plains, you have goosefoot, which is a very hardy plant, which is edible. Almost all the way across the plains, you have various types of wild onions, wild leeks. Anywhere there's any kind of water, there are a variety of other things that are edible that are along the way, but they would not be recognizable to someone who did not learn a little bit about Native American foodways. Another thing to remember is most of these travelers were traveling along well-used trails. The first travelers along the way, the people who started out in early April, they were going to be able to find more firewood close to the trail that was nice and dry rather than green wood. They were likely to find more of those wild onions, more crab apples, more other items that might be edible, more soap berries. But they were also more likely to be caught in flash floods. The flash floods in the West are notorious for the fact that a rain in the mountains days away where you could not see it could result in a flash flood where you were. And a lot of people died in those flash floods. So it was much more chancy because there were flash floods, there was quicksand, there were a lot of other things that a little later on in the season, if you were crossing in summer when the rivers are lower, you would not have the same problems. So the people who were early had one advantage, they had one gigantic disadvantage. The people coming along behind them, well, they would have to hope that they could find some of those things. Some of the other wild plants, dandelion greens. If any of you are clearing the dandelions from your yard and throwing them away, young dandelion greens are delicious. They work great in salads. Dandelion roots are sweet. The people in various parts of Italy actually will collect dandelion roots and put them on pizza. There are things like burdock, camas roots on the Oregon routes. Now, burdock and camas are poisonous when not cooked correctly. So again, you need to not only learn the plants, but the way the Native Americans prepare them. But if you bothered to learn those, you could do very well. The thing that people really were delighted when they could find it, of course, were the herds of buffalo. Now, this particular image, I don't know whether it was somebody who never tried it or heard a story one time and decided to illustrate it. There you see a man who has a buffalo gun slung across his back, shooting at a buffalo with a pistol. The buffalo gun has a ball that is two times as large, propelled by 4 times as much powder. So anybody who would shoot at a buffalo with a pistol when they've got a buffalo gun is an idiot. To shoot a buffalo and kill it, you are going through a very, very thick layer of muscle. He's shooting at the buffalo. If you look at where he's shooting, he's not shooting at the head, he's shooting at the neck and body. It is ridiculously unlikely. He would have to do something like hit the windpipe to do something that would even slow down that buffalo. There are numerous reports from people who tried it, who would shoot a buffalo 3 or 4 times, and unless they got the animal in some vital point, the animal would just keep on going. Buffalo are tough. And the problem with them is, if you do shoot a buffalo and you get something like a shot in the lungs or a shot that will kill them but slowly, that buffalo can go a mile or 2 away from you, maybe more. They weigh 1,000 pounds and can absorb several bullets. And if you go off the trail by miles and shoot a buffalo, you're going to have to butcher that animal there and drag the meat back. And this is a lot of effort. And a lot of the people who made that trip never saw a buffalo except in the far distance. They're dumb, but even buffalo are not so dumb that they will decide to wander over and crop grass next to a wagon train that is setting up a great cloud of dust. You have to come up on them. Alonzo Delano, our friend there, who's the humorist, his party tried living off the land after getting lost and actively hunted for buffalo. They saw elk and deer, but despite repeated shots, never managed to hit them and had no luck with prairie dogs. And I mean, why they would try to shoot at a prairie dog? An adult prairie dog weighs about 2.5 pounds, and most of that is not meat. So why they even tried for those, unless it's just, well, they were incompetent. He did record eating raccoon, badger, duck, and fish. I hope they didn't shoot the fish, but being Alonzo Delano, maybe they tried. Raccoon is actually very good eating if you know how to prepare it. There is a wonderful book called Mark Twain's Feast. Yes, I love libraries, so I'm going to send you to some of these. Look at the book Mark Twain's Feast, and it has information about how to eat some of the things that Mark Twain recorded, and he includes prairie chicken, which they were undoubtedly eating, and raccoon. And raccoon has nasty, stinky fat that goes rancid quickly. But if you shoot the raccoon and immediately remove the fat, they are reportedly great eating. So he reported, Mr. Delano reported that the abundance of game was greatest during the time they were lost. And then once they joined the main trail, they didn't see the deer or anything else that wanted to be edible anymore. So these forage foods are seasonal. They were following the people who were coming along behind the other wagon trains. They were coming along people who had probably stripped the local underbrush of all the green wood, of anything they could get off of it easily. So they lived by burning the manure from the people who were in front of them. Yes, you can burn the manure from oxen. I have had food that was cooked over burning manure when I was in India. People in India use burning manure. Manure, when properly aged, and this would have been because it would have been sitting in the hot sun for months, has virtually no smell of cooking. Another place where they cook using manure, where I have had it, is Iceland. There is a style of Icelandic smoked lamb called hangeyot, which is delicious. It has a nice grassy smell that results in being cooked over the sheep manure. So I have eaten food cooked over manure. It is not as bad as it sounds. I will not only say that, it's not just not as bad as it sounds, it's good. If you do this, be sure to age it. Otherwise, both your guests and your neighbors will complain about the smell of burning damp manure. So most people were cooking directly over the coals, like the images you saw earlier, but smart travelers brought something with them: portable stoves. This is an image from 1866 of a dinner on the prairie, and that is a kind of tin stove. The stovepipe on that folds up so that it will fit in the back of the wagon, and it is far, far more efficient in its use of fuel. And this was the way smart people were cooking on the prairie. And that's not a new idea. Stoves like that go back to colonial American days, but better, cheaper, and lighter ones. The colonial American portable stoves were made out of cast iron. These were made out of tin and out of various other metals. They were available, and they were something that was used for any type of camping journey as well as for long journeys like this. Now, this brings up a question, where we see these people who are cooking in this manner, where you see people who are cooking where they have their pots. They're able, you can see the lady in the back, you can't see what she is cooking, but she has a cooking spoon there. We can assume she's cooking over a pot, and she's not standing next to a tripod. She's probably standing next to another one of these stoves. One of the things that I have been looking for very, very hard is for the ways in which people brought things that reflected their food culture. Anyone in this era probably was no more, the majority were no more than 2 generations from someone who had come from a different place, from Europe, from the Caribbean, from someplace with a distinctive food culture. And I have been looking for years for examples of people who wrote in their diaries, gosh, we're downwind from the Italians again, and they're cooking with all that garlic. Or I tried some beans made by the Hungarians, and they use this stuff called paprika, and I think I'm going to try it when I get home. I've been looking for these examples where people talk about these specific food ways, because I find it hard to imagine that all of these people followed those recipe guides in those books so slavishly that they didn't bring something from home. How difficult would it be for the Danish pioneers, and there were plenty of them, to have brought some caraway to toss into their bread so they could have had the caraway bread and biscuits that they loved? It would not have been difficult. And one of the challenges that I would like to set for those of you who are watching this back in Kansas and elsewhere in the Midwest, start looking through these diaries, start looking through the resources you have, and see if you can find any of these in your museum archives in other places. I would love to know about this, because sometime I would love for someone to contact me. I have a website. We'll be giving that out toward the end of this. I am looking for that. I have been looking for years. I have contacted the Kansas State Historical Society and the Missouri State Historical Society. Utah, I have contacted almost all the states in between. I have not found that. I believe it must have happened, but I haven't found it yet. I'm looking, and I would like to ask you to help me. So that's a little detour from this. We can't know that that happened, whether people brought dried garlic, dried paprika, dried caraway, some of these spices that take very little time, but give someone cooking the way their mother, their grandmother cooked. What we can know is the pioneers prized and doled out sparingly their stocks of those preserved luxury foods. And one of the examples that I have from this is from a fantastic book. Yes, I'm recommending books again. This one is called Women's Diaries of the Westward Journey. Women's Diaries of the Westward Journey is the best single portrayal of what it was like in the first person to take this journey. And a lot of these diaries are horrifying. You have women who are matter-of-factly recording the death of their husbands, the deaths of their children, the illness and injuries that happened to their party, and they just wrote them down, and there it was. That's just what happened today, onward to tomorrow. It is shocking and inspiring. But there is one particular thing from the diary of a woman by the name of Nancy Powers. Nancy Powers was a woman whose husband, Americus, had fancied himself as a very smart man. And he decided that when he got to California, he was going to have all of the materials available to open a store. So he researched what it was that would be needed in California, stocked a wagon with it, and hired a man to drive that wagon so that when they got there, they could set up and they could get rich selling to the miners in California. And he almost did everything right, but he got too greedy. He insisted on using a pair of purebred horses to pull his wagon instead of oxen. And that purebred horse, those purebred horses that were pulling his supply wagon were not strong enough to get it through a fast river. The wagon was washed away along with all of the possessions and also along with the person they had hired to drive it. And Americus Powers went into what we would call nowadays a nervous breakdown. He became like a zombie. He was useless. He had previously been one of the organizers of the entire trip, and he became a liability. And the other men and women on the trip pitched in to help Nancy Powers and her children. And during his convalescence, which took over a month, they helped. And when Americus regained his sanity, his wife was so grateful that she got all of her dried strawberries. And out there in the middle of the prairies, she made strawberry shortcakes and surprised the people who had helped. And this is one of those stories about the magnified power of food to comfort people in the harshest and most hostile environments. When those people had that, they were getting a gift more priceless than gold. You cannot eat gold. Gold cannot give you the comfort of those strawberries in the middle of the prairie. It was an expression of love and respect that was entirely universal. Well, the era of the wagon trains lasted less than a quarter of a century after new technologies made all travel across the plains more comfortable. You only had about 23 years before railroads started making the trip. And then for the people who were still traveling along the plains, there was another item that existed. And I want to show this, even though it is not part of the trip across the prairie, because I want to make a distinction about the chuck wagon. The chuck wagon was invented by someone named Charles Goodnight, so that the people who were driving cattle from Texas to the Midwest would not have to cook for themselves. It was made so you could have one professional cook who would take care of everybody. And sometimes when I ask people to guess, where was a chuck wagon in that train of people with all that cattle? Well, the answer is it was at the front. The chuck wagon would go racing ahead first thing in the morning after serving everybody their breakfast. The chuck wagon would go racing ahead to the place they would stop. And then the cook would spend all day cooking. And it's there that he could make the things much, much better. He could make those beans fresh every day by putting them in a Dutch oven and putting it down in the coals. And then above the coals with the Dutch oven, that cook could make biscuits. And it enabled an entirely superior type of dining. So chuck wagon dining was much, much better. And they were invented in 1866. And it's only 3 years later that the Golden Spike was driven in Utah and dining cars carried people, serving them varied meals while traversing the dusty plains that had claimed so many lives. The pioneer era of riding across the country was at the end because they were riding on rails now. The legends have lived on. So, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I wonder if anybody has any questions.
Well, I am sure that they do. Thank you so much for that awesome presentation about a topic that we really don't get too many opportunities to dive into. So let's start rolling.
As I mentioned when I was talking with you earlier, if any of the people out there are interested in this kind of thing, as far as I know, there is no Kansas and Missouri Culinary History Organization. If someone wants to start one, it is not that difficult. It just involves getting a bunch of like-minded people and starting. If you affiliate with a library, then or a museum, then when you go back to having in-person events again, you have a place where you can do it. But it's something anyone can do. It's tremendously rewarding, and you discover things that will amplify all of the knowledge that you have about this period. That was a commercial for starting. I'm trying to Johnny Appleseed some culinary history places out there, and sometimes it works. So yes, questions, please.
Well, you heard it, folks. We cannot let Richard Foss down, so we need to get to work here. But in the meantime, we will explore some of these questions. So we have one person here, Isaac. As I listen to this, I'm making pasta right now. Did any of the travelers on the trail make that? I'm guessing not, because the main wave of Italian immigrants didn't come until the 1880s.
Well, there were Italian immigrants prior to the 1880s for a variety of reasons. First of all, you had in Italy, there was a process by which what was there. There was no Italy. Italy was a linguistic expression. You were Italian if you spoke Italian. When you read about Italians in America, at this period of time, they could have meant Swiss people who spoke Italian. They could have meant Croatians who spoke Italian. They could have meant anybody who spoke Italian. It's not a geographic thing. Remember, but though at this time, all Italians did not eat pasta at that period of time. People in Milan and in the west of Italy, in the east of Italy, rather, it was relatively rare that people in the north and east of Italy were eating pasta at this time. That was something that was more in the south of Italy. So not even all Italians ate pasta. I have not seen examples of people carrying dried pasta, though the materials for pasta are exactly the same as the materials for bread. You can make a pasta out of flour, water, and salt. So there's nothing to stop them from doing it. However, no, I have not seen an example of it. Incidentally, if you did see that in the United States, you will sometimes see it spelled P-A-S-T-E, and someone will see it as, well, the Italians are eating paste. You know what? What's in library paste? Flour and water. So yes, library paste is edible, won't kill you. It's not the best thing to eat. So if don't chew on your library books here. That's not what they use anymore. But in that era, the word paste and pasta, they used them fairly interchangeably, and there would have been nothing whatsoever to stop Italians from making it. But I haven't found that. That was a long answer to a short question, wasn't it? You may get some of these.
Wonderful. It's all about the journey to get to that answer. So it's very enjoyable. What did travelers use the vinegar that they packed for? I know you mentioned a keg of vinegar in one of the guidebooks.
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, adding some vinegar to your beans adds a little tang to the beans. It adds vitamins, but they also use the vinegar and salt as preservatives for any meat that if they shot a buffalo, they probably would have taken some of that meat. You're not going to, I mean, that's fresh meat. You don't have the chance to smoke it, dry it, and cure it. You would stick it in some vinegar so that you could pickle it. And one of the things about pickles, going back to the Elizabethan era, which was the first era of culinary history that I really studied a lot, one of the things that I found delightful was discovering that nowadays, if a person eats pickles, it's because they like pickles. Going back as far as the Elizabethan era, people knew that you could take your pickles, they would pickle something that's a very summer vegetable like green beans, and then they would take those and wash them 4 or 5 times so they could unpickle them. And then you could have fresh green beans in the middle of winter. And the same kind of thing happened. When you take the idea of pickled raw meat and you think, well, that doesn't sound fantastically appetizing. It's like, well, first of all, my grandmother's sauerbraten used lots of pickle juice in it, and it was just fine. Thank you. Cooking meat in that savory vinegar it tenderizes it, which buffalo is a very low fat meat. You would want to tenderize that buffalo. So yeah, you have plenty of uses for the vinegar.
We are learning a lot this evening. This is awesome.
This is what happens when you have an obsessive person studying something for 30 years. You turn into me.
Well, these questions just keep rolling on in. A reference to the bacon of the Westward trails, not the bacon today. We have a question asking, is this country, I know this as country ham, is that why it's called that?
Well, I don't have a good answer to your question, except that country ham is more like, my best guess is it's called country ham because of the fact that it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And in the United States, until the middle of the century and the rural electrification program, people didn't have refrigeration. So country people had to use a country ham as opposed to a ham that was softer and more immediately edible, but which required refrigeration. That is my best guess, and I will say that it's only a guess.
Sounds like a good guess to me. So let's see, what else? Did they take coffee? Seems like with no nutritional value, it wouldn't be worth the space and trouble, but you always hear it talked about. So
yeah, well, I mentioned that they did bring coffee, and There's nutrition and there's morale. And if you're used to drinking coffee, coffee is very good for your morale and for your stamina. So, in fact, they didn't know it, but if you look at modern articles about the health benefits of drinking coffee, it was probably good for them.
So when they prepared the coffee, was this something like Cowboy Coffee, where you're gonna have grounds and things in it? I mean, is this how similar texture wise would their coffee be to the cup of coffee we're getting today?
They did not have a proper percolator. What they did have was typically that a pot that had a very steep side and triangular bottom. And the advantage to that is when you are pouring from that pot, if you hold the pot for a moment or two, or just tip the pot on its edge, all the grounds or almost all the grounds will go back into that corner. And then if you very slowly pour it, you can get coffee that has little or no grounds in it. If you happen to have eggs and eggshells, if you drop an eggshell into Cowboy Coffee, there's a chemical reaction of the eggshell that will cause all the grounds to go to the bottom, even if you're using a regular pot, and you can pour them off much more easily.
Well, I wonder how many people that are listening to this are about to go try this.
I
That sounds
I will
awesome.
mention one thing. There's one thing I will warn you about, which is I roast my own coffee about every other day here. I am a devoted coffee fan, and just about everybody who has heard about this lecture, who I don't warn, sooner or later decides, I think I'll get some green coffee beans and try roasting them at home. Well, I mentioned that coffee pops like popcorn. One of the things about when coffee pops like popcorn, unlike regular popcorn, coffee has a very hard shell, and when it pops, the shell doesn't stay attached in any way, it goes flying off. And if you want to mess up a kitchen, there's hardly any better way to have greasy coffee chaff going all over the walls. It will take you so long to clean off. It's something that people only do once. This is something you either do outside, which I have done outside with a little butane or electric. You shake the coffee beans and keep them moving. They pop like popcorn. They will pop once and start turning brown, and then they pop twice. When you hear what you call the second crack, when it pops for the second time, you take that coffee and you're still shaking it to keep it moving. Then you pour it into a metal, like a metal basin, and you pour it back and forth to cool it down, because you want it to stop, because the coffee is very dense and it will keep on cooking unless you cool it down. The other thing you can do that also works is to go to a thrift store and get one of those popcorn poppers, the air popcorn poppers.
Right.
You can generally find one of those for $5 to $7, and you can roast coffee in those. And if you look on the internet under roasting coffee using a popcorn popper, you will find an unbelievable number of advice and videos on how to do it. I have done this, and I have a friend who is a coffee connoisseur, and we've done this together, and you can get an entirely decent cup of coffee out of this. Again, when you first roast coffee, people think they're doing it wrong because it smells terrible, because what you're first smelling is the burning exterior husk, which is not what you are drinking. Coffee beans, for the first couple of hours after they are roasted, the first thing to come off of them is nitrogen, which is a colorless, odorless gas. And after about 2 hours of releasing nitrogen, they start oxidizing. And as they start oxidizing, you start to get the fruity and winey flavors. And coffee that is just roasted, the best cup of coffee I had in my life was some Ethiopian coffee that had been roasted about 6-8 hours before. And I tasted and I said, somebody put like some cherry flavoring in this. And they said, no, you're just tasting it the way it tastes when you do it exactly right. So it's like, this coffee tastes like cherries. Well, if you look at coffees on the vine, they look like cherries because they are distantly related. So yeah, coffee can have a cherry-like or peach-like or stone fruit flavors that are just absolutely amazing, but don't do that in the house.
Well, I think you have enough material to probably give an entire presentation just on coffee.
I have.
It doesn't surprise me.
But there are other people who do it better, so I don't want to. There are other people who do it better.
Did any travelers happen to bring cocoa or chocolate?
Very good question. The thing about cocoa and chocolate is Cocoa and chocolate in this period were mainly grown within, they had been part of the Spanish Empire and Mexico, and most people in the American Midwest, it was a rare and expensive thing at that time. That's something that would become cheaper once they got to California. In the California missions, coffee was unknown, but chocolate was an everyday beverage. It was what the monks used when they were fasting. They would drink chocolate. And as a matter of fact, it was so deeply ingrained. People in California loved it so much that there was a monk at one isolated mission who ran out and sent this tearful letter to Mission Santa Barbara saying, if I don't have any chocolate, no one will come visit me anymore. So, you get that, oh, maybe it's your personality, sir. Sorry, got off track there. But yeah, chocolate, not really very common because cacao, of course, is grown primarily in Western Mexico, in Chiapas, and it's not even grown, it wasn't at that time even grown in Yucatan and the places that were primarily doing trade with Eastern Mexico. So the trade was mostly to California and to other parts of the Spanish Empire, Spanish and Mexican Empire.
Very neat. We've got a shout out from someone, Sarah. Good to see you, Richard. I met you at the Trivedi Winery in Lawrence.
I lost your card. I was trying to figure out who it was that recommended me to the Kansas Historical Society. I was going, that's that woman that I met at Trivedi Winery. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, she asked if you happened to talk about fish. She came in a little bit late and asked if travelers caught fish as they found the occasional creek. Did they ever bring preserved, dried fish? I remember you can salt dry some kinds of fish.
Oh, you can salt and dry almost any kind of fish. Now, as to whether they did it, they definitely did it. One of the things about people on the move is that fishing is something you do when you're stopping for a while. So sometimes people would stop and rest voluntarily or involuntarily. And if they were near water, they would. I have run across examples of people saying that, we had to take a stop because we had a broken wagon and somebody found a creek and, netted some fish or something similar. But in terms of dried fish, I actually have not seen, I can't offhand remember seeing dried fish as a regular condiment. It was not recommended by anybody. Dried fish, unless you have pounded it and dried it, unless you've dried it and then pounded it, it's big and it's not that nutrition dense, with the notable exception of codfish. One of the things, and that's a very East Coast thing, bacalhau, called by the Portuguese and Brazilians, that was something that was used on ocean voyages around the world. But I have seen just little or no use of dried codfish going across the American West, because the fish that you have starting in the Midwest are a lot smaller, and you'd have to completely fillet them and gut them before drying them, because you don't want to do that. And with the relatively small fish compared to a huge codfish or a Lake Superior whitefish, I don't remember seeing it. And I suspect that that's why, because the effort of gutting them, drying them, you have to gut, skin, and dry them. And for a trout, not worth it.
Well, Sarah, thank you for that question. And said that
and thank you
send
again.
another card along as they work here
Excellent.
at KSHS. This is another good question. For the food supply lists that travelers used, how many people were those lists estimating for?
Those were estimated, they refer to that as a family, typically like a family of 4 to 6 people. Families tended to be large during that time. So I'm looking at most of them, you would guess that as for one wagon load of people, and a wagon load was typically 2 adults, you'd be figuring probably 2 adults, 2 children who are old enough to help, and maybe another one who's a newborn. There were a lot of children born along the trail who unfortunately didn't make it, because the combination of all of the exertion, the inability to keep sanitary situations, a lot of them died. Now, I'll mention one other thing, which I should have mentioned before. The fact that people were using oxen did mean that some of the families who had cows, could keep the cow, as long as the cows had grass to eat, they could keep milking the cows and they could make a kind of chowder with their beans. The thing about it is, when they start going across the desert, they have to stop doing this because of the fact that if anybody, any woman who has been lactating will remember that during the period of time she was nursing, she's hungry all the time. Cows are no different. You need to feed a cow a lot in order to keep it fat and healthy while it's nursing. So when you get to the desert, when you're worried about actually running out of food for your cows, you're going to run out of milk.
Very interesting. Let's see, we have another question. Did people bring foods for special occasions like birthdays and holidays? Is that when you would bust out the strawberry shortcake on?
Yeah, I would presume that that's when you would bring out some of the dried fruit. They were trying to husband it. One of the things about this is, of course, some of the people who were leaving were going to have a journey of as little as 2.5 months. Some of them were going to have a 4-month or 5-month journey, and they had no idea. It depended on the weather conditions, the river conditions. Some of the diaries that you'll read, they were stuck at a riverbank for a week because the river was running too fast. And, so when you have no idea how long your journey is going to last, you're real careful with your food and you don't bust that stuff out unless there's a really great reason for it.
I know you've referenced a ton of diaries, journals, travel guides, and I know that you attempted to find some spice information from us in Missouri, but did you utilize any other archives to come about your findings?
When you've been doing something, I've been doing this for years. I have worked with the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. I've done presentations there. I've been a consulting historian there, and I have tried through their resources. I have tried all kinds of resources that I would expect to have information about the trip west and not found it. So yes, I have looked here, Sacramento, Oregon. I have tried various groups that, and just really, I have started people. I still hear from some of them occasionally. When I'm on some culinary historians group event, and someone will say, still haven't found that. So,
well, we had somebody comment about what exactly we were trying to find again. So everybody put on your researcher hat and
the question. As tightly as I could specify it is, in every culture, there are some types of spices or seasonings that are intimately bound up with that culture, with their foodways. And I use the example of paprika with Hungary, because nobody uses paprika quite as much as the Hungarians and in the ways that Hungarians use it. Caraway in bread, sesame in bread. There are other things that are added to breads in different parts of Europe, the Middle East. You can tell where someone is from in Greece by the fact that Northern Greeks will put sesame in their bread, where Southern Greeks wonder why you're polluting that bread by putting those seeds in it. The use of poppy seeds. Well, that's more of something that you will find in Southern and Eastern Greece, but not in the Peloponnese Islands for reasons that I don't understand. Did somebody put rosemary in their bread? There's another item. A lot of people in Southern Europe put rosemary in their bread. There are places where you can say, this is what gives this food its flavor, and that you would think would have been light enough and light and compact enough that people could have brought it. But I just have found it very hard to find examples where someone commented on bringing things that would give their staple foods the flavors of their ancestral homelands.
All right, everybody. Well, we need to do our part in trying to uncover this mystery. So we've got time for one final question here. One of your pictures showed a jug. Was alcohol taken along the trails?
Oh, absolutely. Alcohol at this time was regarded as having medicinal uses, which it did, and for purifying water, which it did. remember that if you look into back as far as colonial America, there were all kinds of warnings about people who had drunk water straight from a well and died. And they did this because of the fact that that well was polluted. Either it was close to sewerage, there was something else wrong with it. Uh, and a little bit of alcohol added to the water would kill bacteria, and they knew that. And so people would drink their water if it was from an unsafe source. Spring water was generally regarded as healthy. River water in a wild place was likely to be healthy, but for all you knew, there was a dead animal upstream. You didn't know. You might add a little alcohol. And they knew about putting alcohol on a wound, and they also knew there were going to be wounds. People were going to get injured. There were examples of people who, for instance, were incautious and their foot was run over by the wagon. So in that circumstance, they knew that pouring alcohol on that wound was going to help it in some way.
Very
Oh
interesting.
yeah, they definitely took alcohol, but they would have been cautious about using it for recreational use. There's probably a lot of people that never realized they were alcoholics until they were, 5 days out of Kansas City and really getting nervous because they had a dependence on alcohol and they didn't know it.
Would aside from adding alcohol to water, would travelers boil water from unsafe sources, or does that take too long for it to sufficiently cool down?
The act of boiling drinking water just to boil drinking water seems to be something that was not widely done. People did not seem to understand the connection. People did not understand the connection between germs and disease. There's a wonderful book about about the history of, it sounds so boring to say the history of sewers, but basically in England, a doctor who had remarkable detective skills figured out he had all of these examples of dysentery from the same London neighborhood, and the only thing that they had in common was they were all drinking from the same water pump. And it took him analyzing that water, discovering the bacteria level, making the connection between that water pump, and then digging up the water pump to discover that there was a break between a neighbor's septic tank and that water pump, and these people were drinking sewage. So you don't have the idea of boiling water, the idea of the disease being caused by bacteria. They may have known as a vague thing that boiled water was healthier, but it was not common knowledge at that time.
Yeah, I think you might be referencing Jon Snow,
Yes.
who, yeah, not from Game of Thrones, but the considered the father of epidemiology.
Yes,
Well,
that's what I was trying to remember.
all right. Well, I am posting Richard Foss's a link in order to be able to purchase books, but his 2 books. But he also recommends picking it up from your local bookstore if you can do that as well.
Yeah, I happened to glance for the first time, and there was that thing that says, "Can someone do a follow-up email with the names of the recommended books?" Do you want me to write that to you so that you can send them out?
Sure thing. Yeah, I can. I actually have quite a few tabs open as well as you were talking about them. But yeah, that would be absolutely wonderful.
Actually, if you have the tabs open that have the current editions of them, some of the ones that I have, like in the case of Bacon, Beans, and Galantines, I have an original University Small Press edition, and I think it was reprinted. So the version that I would have may not be the most current. Okay. But like that and Women's Diaries on the Westward Trail and Alonzo's piece, they're all really enjoyable reading. Bacon, Beans, and Galantines is one of the things that will make you actually want to recreate some of the recipes because he's a very good writer, and his Conlon's enthusiasm for this is fantastic.
Well, we appreciate your enthusiasm for this topic as well. You've done an incredible job. Thank you so much for being here. We've all learned a lot, myself included, and yeah, I can't wait to dive into some of these resources. It's going to be an absolute blast. But I hope you can all join us again next month, May 13th, to hear historian and filmmaker Kara Heitz present on New Deal era federally funded artworks and art programs. Heitz will speak about these and share her short documentary film about New Deal post office murals in Kansas. So from all of us here at Museum After Hours, thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your evening.